Right, well, thank you very much indeed for coming, everybody. My name is Professor David Turner. I'm from the Department of History and Classics here at Swansea University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event, Disability and Wellbeing, Past, Present and Future, as part of the Being Human Festival. Being Human is the UK's only national festival of the humanities, led by the School of Advanced Study at the University of London in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the British Academy and the Wellcome Trust. There are over 300 events in the 2015 programme, organised by universities, galleries and cultural organisations right across the country. And we're very proud here at Swansea University to be one of only 5 hubs coordinating events for the festival. If you'd like to check out the full programme of events, it's available at the Being Human Festival website. And you can follow festival updates on Twitter by following at Being Human Fest. And if you want to tweet about the festival, please use the hashtag BeingHuman15. Finally, I would just like to remind you to please fill out an evaluation form to give the festival some feedback on your experiences today. I believe these are on your seats as you came in. And this will help us assess the Being Human Festival's impacts and identify anything we could improve. So thank you very much for coming and enjoy this event. This is an event about well-being. So what is well-being? Well, before today's event, I decided to take the NHS Wellbeing Self-Assessment, which you can do for yourself on the NHS Choices website. As that's 14 questions, which ask me how often, on a scale ranging from none of the time to all of the time, I felt certain things about myself. So, well-being was measured on the basis of the amount of time I spent thinking about the future, basically none of the time, because I'm a historian, I've got too much going on in the past. It was about my feelings of being useful, relaxed, being interested in others, feeling close to other people, feeling cheerful and feeling loved. It was also measured in terms of whether or not I felt I had energy to spare. Rarely, I answered. Whether I was able to think clearly, and whether I was curious about the world and had an interest in new things. Overall, I got a score of 43 out of 70, which placed me within the typical range for most people, whatever that means. And it said that to improve my well-being, I had to get active, connect with others, be aware of myself, give to others, and to keep learning, which is always good advice for someone working in a university. But how useful are these criteria for measuring well-being, for thinking about the past? Did people measure well-being in the same way in centuries gone by? Moreover, does everyone experience well-being in the same way? It's been interesting to think about well-being in relation to disability, what we're going to do this evening. Many people have assumed that disabled people are unhappy. This is as true of the past as it is of the present. So in the 18th century, for example, philanthropists campaigning for better education for deaf or blind children saw special institutions dedicated to providing them training as a means of rescuing poor afflicted children. The founders of these institutions argued that they would ensure the happiness of disabled children by providing the skills that would make them useful, productive citizens. Pioneering orthopaedic surgeons of the early 20th century, the architects of the modern medical model of disability perhaps, likewise saw their work as improving the lives of physically disabled children and adults by similarly saving them from the neglect they had experienced in past centuries through regimes of surgical correction, training and rehabilitation. Yet in spite of the assumption that disabled people are unhappy, surveys often suggest that disabled people today report a good quality of life. And this is what's known as the disability paradox. The sociologists Gary Albrecht and Patrick Devliger, who coined the term in 1999, found in their research that persons with disabilities had more positive attitudes towards disability than did nurses or other members of the medical faculty and those of the general public at large. Happiness, they argued, was based on a variety of factors, including disabled people having control over their lives, having support from others, having a clear set of values, and having a positive mental attitude. Conversely, pain, fatigue, and unpredictable symptoms could damage quality of life. Absent from their discussion, arguably, was the assessment of the impact of public attitudes, of media images, and government policies on the lives and well-being of disabled people, all of which, as recent campaigns against cuts to services, against unhelpful bureaucratic and medical procedures, and harmful media images of scroungers have highlighted, might play a significant role in affecting the well-being of people with disabilities. So tonight we debate these issues, paying attention to the experience of disabled people in the past as well as the present, and to the question of what can be done to improve well-being in the future. Our speakers reflect a broad range of expertise. Let me introduce Daniel Blackie, Mike Mantin and Alexandra Jones, who are researchers on a project, Disability and Industrial Society, a comparative cultural history of British coalfields, which is a 5-year project funded by the Wellcome Trust, examining the experiences of those disabled in coal mining, the industry that powered Britain's industrial revolution. Our other guest is Andrea Gordon, the engagement manager for Guide Dogs Cymru. Unfortunately, a further speaker, Paul Swan from Disability Wales, was unable to attend this evening due to concerns about travelling as a result of the weather. He lives out in the Brecon Beacons, so was understandably concerned about some of the reports we've had about the weather out there. But I want to begin by talking to Alex and Dan about the experience of disabled people in Wales's industrial past. After that, Mike will show a short film, talk about the importance of rehabilitation to 20th century attempts to restore the health and well-being of disabled workers. And then Andrea will talk about what disability and well-being mean to her. After that, we'll open open up the debate to you and get your opinions and allow you to put questions to the speakers. So once again, I hope you enjoy the evening. Okay, first of all, I'd like to talk to the two academics on either side of me about their work looking at disability in Wales's industrial past. And I suppose one of the questions that we're thinking about tonight is about the meaning of well-being and whether we can apply our understandings of well-being today to thinking about the experiences of people living in times gone by. So Dan, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was thinking, as a disability historian, although well-being is an important concept to our field, it's something that I haven't thought about historicising much. So before I came to this presentation today, this panel, I was thinking very much along the lines that David was suggesting in his opening comments, which, what is well-being and can we apply the concept to the past? So, like a lot of people, when you come to a concept for the first time, I did what I normally do, which is I looked in the Oxford English Dictionary and looked at the definition of well-being. And there are several definitions that the dictionary offers, but the first one is the one that perhaps applies to what we're speaking about today, and it associated well-being with physical, psychological and moral welfare. And I think this is hopefully something most of us would agree upon when we think about well. We think about people's welfare needs, their psychological, physical and moral, mental well-being. Now, I then started to think, well, yeah, Oxford English Dictionary, it's great, especially the online version we have here on at the university. It gives you examples of when this understanding, this definition of well-being was used. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, this definition is current in the English language from the 16th century onwards. Now, as a historian who spent a lot of time looking at 18th and 19th century documents that were generated by the general public, but also by policymakers and politicians, I was struck by this because I started to think, well, actually, the term well-being doesn't come up very much when you read policy documents. And I did a few searches, and one of the wonderful things about being a scholar nowadays is you can do digital searches and search documents that would have taken ages and ages to look through in a couple of clicks of a mouse. And it seemed that well-being isn't used very often in the 19th century policy context. And this made me think, can we really talk about well-being in the way that we do today in the past? And I think, given my area of specialism, which is the 18th and 19th century, I think it is fair enough to say, actually, politicians and Britons and workers in the 19th century did have a concept of well-being, even though they may not have referred to it as that. And I think one thing that strikes me is that the concept of well-being may be a little bit different to what David was talking about earlier with regards to the NHS choice, which I think is quite a psychological one. It's very much about how does the person feel, how does the person think, how is it to be an individual, what are your responses to the world, how do you make sense of the world. But my understanding of well-being, if I look at it through the lens of Victorian written material, sources, which is what we use as historians, it seems to me there was much more emphasis on the material aspects of well-being. So, for instance, I think like nowadays, we would expect all citizens in our community, all members of our community, as a civilised society, would have shelter, care and food. And I think this is something the Victorians would have recognised. They would have said a very basic element, a very basic foundation for somebody's well-being is food, shelter and care should you need it, or support should you need it. One thing I've been struck by my research, and it might be that I'm wrong, this is certainly a virgin territory for research, but one thing I've been struck by is that I think there's less of this psychological understanding of well-being. So for me it seems that 19th century Britons would have seen well-being more as a material question. Are people receiving enough care, support, accommodation, clothing, food, this kind of sort of the basic necessities of life. In saying that, however, I have been struck by a few instances where I've come across reports of disabled workers committing suicide. And newspaper reporters are very keen in the 19th century to attribute suicide to a sense of the person who's committed suicide as having a poor sense of their own well-being. And it seems to me that there is an acknowledgement that psychological aspects of a person's well-being are important. However, one thing I'm struck by when I look at these sources from a modern perspective is that there is an understanding that people can feel bad or that their well-being is not particularly good because of psychological issues, but it's very much individualised. It's something that's seen as, well, the problem is the individual, poor old Joe lost his leg in a mining accident, he can't work, oh, it's obvious that's why he's killed himself. But I think from a modern perspective, in a modern disability studies, disability activism perspective, that would be an unsatisfactory way of looking at well-being nowadays, because although I think most people would understand that there are aspects of well-being that are certainly psychological and that can be rooted in individuals, a disability studies perspective would urge us to say, hey, come on, the fact that the disabled man has killed himself is not because there is something fundamentally wrong with him, but society is not set up to such an extent that it enables him to still be accommodated and integrated into everyday activities. So I think, is that a satisfactory first intervention into this panel discussion?
Well, it's a starting point, isn't it, Dan? So you think about well-being in terms of a kind of combination perhaps of the psychological and the material. And Alex, you look at literature in your work. I mean, what do you think well-being means in the context of things you look at?
Yeah. Well, I think that in terms of well-being, for starters, that the way that human beings Being Human festival, and I don't think that the physical or emotional embodied experience of being human is what has necessarily changed over the past. More the way that societies and cultures in which people live and experience their lives is what has changed. And I think that when we're looking at literature, we're often looking at a creative art form, a way of expressing an attitudes to disability representations, but it's not always as straightforward as just because somebody is being described in literature, it doesn't mean we can directly take that as being said, because of the form in which it's being expressed, which is another issue when we're looking at literature in the past. And so I think, and one of the issues as well is that the way that the issues that come up for disability in modern representations, in not just in literature but in film and television, there's some hotly contested issues about representation, and often these have built on what's gone before, on conventions, on the way things have always been represented. There's certain types of maybe stock character, people who occur again and again. And I think that through looking at literature that's gone before and that might have built into where we are today, you can also see how some of these patterns have developed and interpret them as well. And I think that in terms of the representation of well-being in the literature that I look at in particular, there's more of a pursuit of people's emotional relationship with disability, and also so it goes into a lot of detail about personal relationships and things like that you get in the novel form that you wouldn't necessarily get in a historical source or in something like that. So you can look at the way people were treating these sort of relationships and attitudes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I guess there's two elements in, aren't there, really? One is the material side, there's the emotional side, and I'd like to ask you both a bit more about those things. So in terms of support, first of all, Dan, I mean, I guess nowadays, the issue of support for disabled people is quite an important political issue. What kind of support is there for disabled people in the period that you're looking at in the Victorian age? Is it all just about workhouses and shutting people away?
No, I think it's very diverse, and I think probably the word I would best describe to the kinds of support that disabled people in the 19th century receiving is a patchwork of care. It's a patchwork of support. There is no one super source of support or care. People don't necessarily turn to the state. They will turn to formal and informal sources of assistance. And well, there's a lot we could talk about, but I think the state is only one aspect of the formal system of care and support that disabled people could turn to. There is also a very rich tradition of mutualism in the Welsh coalfields, where basically workers would get together and concoct schemes where they could support one another in times of hardship or need. And one of the perhaps best examples of this are the friendly societies that were formed in many working class communities throughout the 19th century. And these basically paid out sick benefit for people that paid in money to these essentially insurance schemes. Then you can also get informal support. I mean, these people that were disabled, like say people today, had husbands and wives and daughters and aunts and uncles and friends and family, and very often a lot of this support was provided by those nearest and dearest to these people. So there's a lot of different avenues of assistance and support that disabled people drew upon, but I think it was much more diverse, and a disabled person would look to various sources of assistance rather than necessarily turn first and foremost to the state.
I guess there are changes over the course of the Victorian period, aren't there? They, towards the end of the 19th century, the state is providing more of a legal framework for workers who are injured on the job to get compensation. So does that mean things are... Can we talk that in terms of progress and things getting better, do you think, for disabled workers?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I think it's like anything. There were two sides. On the one hand, you could say, well, compensation legislation is a great thing, and at first glance, yeah, great. I mean, if you're injured at work, it would be nice to think that if you're unable to work or you have financial difficulties due to an incapacity for work, that your employer would compensate you. But it's a little bit of a two-sided affair, because although, yes, disabled workers are provided with financial compensation, there's an argument to be made, and I think it's quite a pressing one, although there's perhaps more research needed into it, but there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that compensation laws are actually, in the period that we're looking at, the 19th century, actually quite bad for disabled people, because it means employers, unlike prior to the compensation legislation being passed, are more reluctant to rehire disabled workers. And this is because disabled workers, in the eyes of many employers in the late 19th and early 20th century, are seen as a greater liability to further injury and therefore generating further compensation claims. So yes, we sit in the 21st century and think, great, someone's injured at work. Of course, it's they should have some financial compensation if they're unable to pursue their occupation. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, because in the eyes of the employer, the giving of compensation made disabled workers potentially a greater liability to their business interests, because they were aware that, well, okay, Jack the coal miner has hurt his leg, he's more likely to suffer further occupational injury in the future, therefore I'm just going to be shot of him and not bother rehiring this guy, because I don't want to have a big legal compensation bill in three more years' time. Does that answer the question?
So I guess it's kind of an example really of how things, which on the surface of things are meant to help, actually having kind of damaging long-term effect on the prospects of disabled people's working chances, I suppose.
Well, if we talk about well-being, if we all agree, maybe we don't agree, that's something to talk about in the questions and answers afterwards, but if we agree that participating in the workplace is quite an ordinary everyday life activity, being excluded from the workplace could be seen as marginalising or discriminatory. That could be construed as a negative impact. That's how I would interpret it personally.
Well, I guess we can sort of interpret these sort of things from these kinds of material evidence, but it's with the literature really that you can access sort of some of the feelings associated with this. Well, you mentioned emotions earlier. Can you say a bit more about that, Alex, and the kind of insights your sources tell us about that?
Yes, well, I think that the literature offers quite an interesting picture of emotional reactions to disability and to the way that it's represented people's sort of feelings about these about becoming disabled through an accident in the coal mine, which is what I've been looking at. But it's not always straightforwardly a tragic or a sad event, which is what I think is it is a big stereotype that we see. And I think that Dan mentioned before about a disabled miner committing suicide and how that was interpreted. And this actually occurs in the literature, where particularly with miners who've had a crash injury and have become paralysed, and you would have the story sort of almost always evolved in the same way, involving increasing feelings of depression, isolation, crisis of masculinity, and it always seems to descend the same way into the final point of crisis is suicide, and that's sort of a literary convention which speaks to that stereotype of tragedy and of the sort of the grim, what I think Alison Cave calls the grim imagined futures for disabled people, where the future prospects are always imagined to be grim, regardless of whether they are or not. And that feeds into the way that literature then depicts these futures. But in contrast, there are also characters who are not as bleak as that. There's in one particular character who is a sort of stock feature of the literature is the man with the wooden leg, and this character is quite a jolly. I mean, again, you can interpret it as being a bit condescending, but he's always an upbeat character. He tends to tell jokes and be quite sarcastic, and his reaction is always to sort of he's not treated in the same way, it's not treated as a tragedy in the same way. So there is a sort of different ways that disability is interpreted, and it depends a lot on the type of disability being represented, I think. And again, in both those examples, I've used examples of men who've been disabled in the coal industry in particular, but I think we get a very different picture when we look at the representation of women. And I think that in the case of women, one of the things I found is that women are represented as being sort of ground down by the work that they do in looking after the men and the household. So the kind of disability that's represented for women tends to be premature aging and physically being eaten away almost, consumed by the work that they're doing, and they sort of become increasingly frail, and they sort of develop various complications. One of the novels refers to this as the breaking, meaning you're physically just breaking, and he refers to women's bodies like machines that wear out, like a metaphor of the coal industry. And I think that, therefore, when you're sort of looking at women, in particular in the way they're represented, there's a lot of representation of emotional strain as well, which ties into the image of how their disability is sort of depicted. And I think that's you can see the way that even though there would have been women who were disabled in other ways, the way that literature represents women, it sort of falls into these sort of categories and these sort of pigeonholes of types of disability.
Well, thanks very much, Alex. I mean, that's very useful to mention women, because it's reminds us that ideas about well-being and disability can be distinctly gendered.